Welcome back to Koine Corner. Today we're going to talk about the introduction to the Sermon on the Mount. There are several little interesting grammatical and thematic nuggets for us to unpack. And let's start by taking a look at Matthew chapter 5, verses 1 and 2, and this is my translation of those two verses. And seeing the crowds, he went up unto the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him, and after opening his mouth, he was teaching them while saying. So let's take a look at it in Koine. We'll take the first phrase. Idonde tous oklus anebe eis to oros. So idonde is and while seeing or but while seeing. Tous oklus, the crowds. Anebe, simple aorist active indicative third person singular. He went up, and then eis to oros, into or unto the mountain. Very straightforward. So let's go on to the second chunk where it gets a little more interesting. Kai kathisantos autou proselphan auto hoi mathetai autou. So kai kathisantos autou, and after he sat down, that's going to be pretty interesting in just a moment. Proselphan, they came to him, auto. Who came to him? Hoi mathetai autou, his disciples. So this is where the grammar gets interesting. Let's take another look at kathisantos autou. This is what's known as a genitive absolute. So a genitive absolute in its grammatical construction is a participle in the genitive case, the subject of which is also in the genitive case. Whether that subject is a noun, a pronoun, a substantival adjective, it's just the subject of the participle is also in the genitive case. But somebody out there is saying, but wait a minute, I thought the nominative case is the case for the subject. And you are correct. That's how we know that the genitive participle paired with a genitive subject is in fact a genitive absolute. Well, what makes it an absolute? It's absolute in the sense that it's not grammatically tied to the rest of the sentence. So let me give you an English example. While crying, the boy rode his bicycle down the street. So while crying is probably significant for the meaning of the sentence, but it's grammatically independent. In other words, it's absolute. We can take while crying out of there, and the sentence is still a sentence. The boy rode his bicycle down the street. So the genitive absolute is grammatically untied or unrelated to any of the rest of the content of the sentence. But that doesn't mean that it's meaningless or that it's unimportant. It just means that it stands absolute, independent, grammatically from the rest of it. Most genitive absolutes are temporal. So if the participle is in the present tense, it would convey while doing something, while crying. If it's in the aorist tense, it would convey after doing something, after crying, or in this case, after he sat down. Kathisantos autou, after he sat down. So Matthew is the most, Matthew is the most Hebraic of the four Gospels. It seems clear that he's writing to a largely Jewish audience, and the themes and the things that he emphasizes are of a more Hebrew interest than a Gentile interest. For instance, in his genealogy in chapter 1, he ties Jesus genetically to both Abraham and David. He also thematically ties him to Moses. Jesus goes off and spends time in Egypt as an infant and survives a slaughter of the innocents, much like Moses did, being secreted away and protected, divine protection, so that he wouldn't be found and murdered by forces that didn't want him to be. Much like Moses brings the law down from the mountain, when we get to the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus goes up on the mountain and communicates a new interpretation of the law. Somebody might find that notion offensive. I apologize in advance if you're troubled by that, but he's going to come out and say things like, "You have heard it said, but I say to you," etc. So this is a very sort of a Jewish-themed gospel compared to, for instance, Mark, who launches in at John the Baptist and doesn't take time to tell us about Jesus' genealogy, or Luke, who ties Jesus rather than just to David and Abraham, but ties him back to Adam. The Gentile writing to a largely Gentile audience wants us to see Jesus as a human tied to Adam, more so than just as a Jew tied to Abraham or to David, tied to the son of David, the promised Messiah. And of course, John takes us back all the way to creation. In the beginning was the Word, right? So here, in this most Jewish of Gospels, we see a couple things. We're told that Jesus sees the crowd, goes up on the mountain, and then we're told after sitting down, his disciples came to him. They gathered around him. So rabbinical teaching, the teaching from rabbis, is teaching generally from a seated position. So even though the genitive absolute is grammatically independent, it's not thematically independent. Jesus positions himself in the posture of a rabbi and prepares to teach. Which brings us to the rest of the verse, actually to verse 2. Kai anoixas to stoma autou, edidasken autus legon. So kai is and, obviously, anoixas, opening, after opening, to stoma autou, his mouth, after opening his mouth, edidasken, imperfect tense, he was teaching them, autus, while saying, legon. And after opening his mouth, he was teaching them while saying. And the present participle legon, while saying, introduces us to verse 3, the first of the Beatitudes. Makarioi, hoiptokoi, to pneumati. So, makarioi, blessed or happy, hoiptokoi, the poor, which poor? Modified by to pneumati, the ones in spirit. Blessed are, we're supplying the verb to be, are. Blessed are the poor in spirit. So this is called a predicate nominative. The subject and the predicate of the subject are both in the nominative case, where normally we would expect a subject, a verb, and a predicate, right? But here in the predicate nominative, both the subject and the predicate are in the nominative case, and they are modified by the verb to be, some form of the verb to be. Even if the verb isn't there, like in this case, and we have to supply it, what we get is the subject and the predicate joined by the verb to be, telling us about a state of being. So let's take a look. Subject, the poor, which poor? The poor in spirit, hoiptokoi, and the predicate, blessed or happy, makarioi, and what is their relationship to one another? The relationship is through the stative verb to be. In this case, it's are, not is, because both ptoikoi and makarioi are plural. So we use the plural form of the verb to be. Blessed are the poor in spirit. That's the pattern for all the Beatitudes. A predicate nominative followed by an explanation of why the named group is blessed. So let's take a look at the first explanation. Hoti auton estin he basileia ton iranon. So hoti, because or that, auton, genitive plural pronoun, theirs, estin, is, he basileia, the kingdom, singular, and then here comes an interesting nugget, ton iranon, the heavens, plural. We don't translate the heavens as plural in this case for a very simple reason. Even though it's literally the heavens, and in English, when we talk about the heavens, we mean the sun and the moon, the stars, the planets, the clouds, the sky above us. When we talk about heaven, we're talking about a specific place where God lives or where we hope to go, etc. But here, instead of heaven being singular, it's plural because remember, Matthew is the most Hebrew of the four Gospels. Matthew uses the Hebrew or Aramaic sort of plural of majesty. So you've probably heard through your years that the Hebrew word for God, Elohim, is plural. Not because God is multiple gods, but because of the majesty, the greatness of God, he's described in the plural, Elohim. Well, this is an example of that sort of majestic pluralization to show greatness. The kingdom is singular, but it's then described as the kingdom. Which kingdom? The kingdom of the heavens, plural. We translate it singular because we know he's only talking about one kingdom of heaven, but he's talking about its greatness, its majesty. So the Hebrew nature of the author and the Hebrew nature of his intended audience guide his themes and his structure and even his grammar. Where we would expect the kingdom of heaven to be singular, it would be singular in some of the other writings and by some of the other writers, but Matthew pluralizes it. He does this 35 other times with different words in his gospel where we might expect a singular, but we get a plural because he's I'm about to use a word that, for lack of a better one, I don't mean it in any kind of an insulting way, he's pandering to his audience by using a figure of speech or a form that would resonate with them as Jewish readers who have a Hebraic sensibility. Pretty cool stuff. Oodles of good stuff here in the Beatitudes and in the Sermon on the Mount. Next time we get together, we're going to take a look at some more interesting stuff in the Beatitudes, both grammatical and thematical. And until then, as always, charis kai irene humin, grace and peace to you.